Deep in the south, in areas such as Aswan and the western deserts parallel to the Nile, these will be considered peripheral areas. And we start to see this cultural entanglement. And there is an entanglement of this Nubian and Egyptian element from the beginning. Alright guys, I'm back again with the third episode of Black Egypt Review. We've been going over a concise history of the origins of pre-dynastic Egyptian culture. We're focusing strictly on the pre-dynastic period. And today we'll be talking about archaeology. This video today is I'm going to walk you guys through the Egyptian culture diverging from this Sudanese tradition. Right here in relations between Egypt and Nubia in the Gatto period, in the formative years of Egyptian civilization, at the earliest stages, the Neolithic of the Sudanese tradition strongly influenced the culture of Upper Egypt. Here's a map of southern Upper Egypt. This is the most important section of the pre-dynastic period. Not northern Egypt, not Mesopotamia, not Germany, none of that. Maria Gatto observed that Nubian pastoral culture had a great deal of influence on ancient Egypt's social development. This was written in the Egypt in its African Context volume, presented at Manchester. She convincingly demonstrated that the Nubian pastoral nomads were the African ancestors of Egypt and also played a role in the origin of the entire African pastoral tradition. Her analysis also showed that influence between Egypt and Nubia went both ways, not just one way. And she also clearly demonstrated that Nubia's role in the social development of Africa is very real. There was no major migration or replacement events occurring in the pre-dynastic or early dynastic period of Egypt. This was all a local development. As for the prehistoric wanderings of Indo-Europeans, they were still trying to figure out where they were going. The Delta did not have pre-dynastic Egyptian kings, nor did they have any sort of political social structure such as the southern Egyptians had. And we need to remember that when they make this big focus on the Delta, trying to find Mesopotamian Egyptians. So let's start talking about ceramic traditions. We need to consider the gilf kebir. We need to consider nabta. We need to consider the oasis. We also need to consider Western Egypt. And let's not forget east of the Nile Valley too. When we're talking about the birth of Egyptian culture, what was going on at that time was a process of cultural mixing in the boundary areas. And as we see right here in cultural entanglement, this was clearly detectable in the material culture and is much more complex and multidimensional than previously thought. Which is very true. Now, I presented Maria Gatto on this channel about 4 years ago. She's very high powered and she does some very deep research on North Africa. Here she writes that what can be safely stated is that at this stage, evidence points to an earlier presence of Nubian population in the area. We see right here that early Upper Egyptian cultures were Nubian related, and also findings from the same age from both the eastern and western deserts. When it comes to the origins of Egyptian culture, there were influences coming from many directions, not just one direction. It is important to say, and this is something important to highlight, she writes, that the cultural substratum in Upper Egypt as a whole is mostly Nubian related, and the earliest evidence of the Nabta culture is attested in the Abydos Nabta region. From my last video, Prowse and Lovell wrote that the ruling elite segment at Nabta was more of a Nubian type. Going back before that, the biological affinities of the people in southern Egypt were more related to Nubians. They were also related to later Egyptians. As far as the Near East is concerned, as far as Mesopotamia, there were long-standing interregional contacts, which is completely normal, but There was no migration, colonization, or domination. This has been stated many times. Ms. Gatto writes, it's highly unlikely that the arrival of nabta means migration of people from the north, colonization, or domination of the local communities. But instead, what we see is an ideological system based on a shared set of beliefs and practices on both the personal and public levels. And so when we move forward, getting closer to Dynasty Zero, getting closer to what can be now identified as Egyptian culture, what we have is a cultural entanglement going on at that time. And when we have the rise of the nabta culture of Upper and Middle Egyptian society, there becomes a split from the original root. And what we see is Nubian elements in nabta material culture and beliefs becoming less and less visible, because now there is a new identity with a certain set of people. And so deep in the south, in areas such as Aswan and the western deserts parallel to the Nile, these will be considered peripheral areas. And we start to see this cultural entanglement. And I talked about this on the channel before. We go through the material culture, and there is an entanglement of this Nubian and Egyptian element from the beginning. And we see where Ms. Gatto writes right here that the archaeological discoveries of the past years clearly demonstrate that the first cataract was not a real border, just like how the Sahara Desert is not a real border. And as we move forward, as we start now seeing ideas of so-called Egyptian kingdoms rising up, then we start getting more independent ideas, more independent cultural elements, and we start seeing the concept of duality, Egypt in opposition to others. Examples of that can be found in rock art dating back to Dynasty Zero. Here on the screen we see an individual from Seti, the land of the bow, and these types of individuals were in Jubilee processions with the original followers of Horus. Now, even closer to Dynasty Zero, we start seeing images of the king smiting his enemies, symbolic representations of order over chaos, and it was at this time that the Egyptian royal ideology needed to have an other as a justification for its existence. And so what we have is certain Nubian kingdoms that were competing with them, who went from being the same to becoming the other. At this time, there was competition in the Nile Valley, in the deepest parts of southern Egypt. Right here, Bruce Williams writes that, also paralleling the rapid political development of the nabta culture, pharaonic institutions appeared in A group Nubia, presented in as coherent a manner as found in Egypt. Before we started seeing this diversification of cultures, there was no A group Nubia and there was no Egyptian thing. Each of those things was a development of something previously that was more united. By the end of this early phase, we see pharaonic representations and burial customs, and there's also evidence of intentional contrast within a shared tradition, something that could be called a polarization. This itself goes hand in hand with what Ms. Gatto was just saying, that the Egyptian royal ideology needed an other as a justification for its existence, and the Nubians went from being the same to becoming the other, and it's no small coincidence that the first nome of Egypt was Seti. In the northern Egypt, the delta had regionally characteristic features, but there are no signs of an evolving elitist state-based organization. The southern Egyptians were not competing with the north. When you compare that to Upper Egypt, they had centers of powerful territories, each ruled by a hereditary elite exercising authority on a regional basis. So when we go down to the south to see what this new Egyptian culture was competing with, we see the royal scorpion from the land of the bow. Again, when it comes to anything European or Arabic or anything else for that matter, they are nowhere on the scene. We have this individual from the land of the bow. This location where this is found at, also found at that location, are some of the earliest royal symbols of ancient Egypt. So we know that there were Nubians there when the very first, most earliest Egyptian kings showed up on the scene. Here we see palace facades, we see royal imagery. All of this is found with the Nubians, found with the Sudanese, found in southern Egypt. We have the custal incense burner. Nubian tombs at this time were the same size as Egyptian tombs. And we see that both in the pre-dynastic of Egypt and also pre-dynastic Nubians, both wore the white crown. And so obviously they were striving with each other, but only one could reign supreme. Again, there was no extensive interpersonal conflict for control over others that they know of in the pre-pottery Neolithic of the southern Levant, so we can get any idea of the Caucasian takeover out of our head now. But there was a infiltration of these people into Egypt to become Egyptians. That is true. And when we compare all of this to Mesopotamia, one thing that we do need to remember is that Mesopotamia in ancient times, at this time that we're talking about, there was no real geographic unity and it had no permanent capital city. And it stands out from other civilizations with greater uniformity, particularly that of Egypt. I got that out of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Here we take a look at the fake Ancient Origins website, which is always printing up fantasy stories. They're over here talking about that was the capital of the Sumerian civilization. But when we go to an actual source such as the Britannica, there was no geographic unity and there was no permanent capital city. The Sumerians, Mesopotamians are always built up into something that they're not. When we continue to research through Encyclopedia Britannica, we see the first king to unite the separate city-states was in about 2800 BC, which is long after Egypt had already been established. And Sargon came hundreds of years later. Point of that being is that the Egyptians were organized long before the Sumerians were organized. Despite the fact that their cities are old, they were not united into any sort of nation or kingdom of any kind until later. And so we walked through the origins of Egyptian culture. We could go much deeper, but this is YouTube and we don't really have that much time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.